How Manhattan made a profit on 146 bodies. The building was engineered to survive fire, and the workers were engineered to be expendable. In 1911, 146 garment workers burned to death inside a locked Manhattan factory. Textbooks call it a tragedy. The ledger calls it an arbitrage opportunity. The owners locked the exit doors to protect 15 cents worth of fabric, and when the smoke cleared, they did not go to prison. They collected the insurance. They made a net profit of $400 per corpse. This is the forensic audit of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The workers did not die in a panic. They died in a spreadsheet. Chapter 1. The Fireproof Architecture. On March 25, 1911, the asset survived. That is the cleanest opening line in the file. The Asch Building stood at 23 to 29 Washington Place, at the corner of Green Street, just east of Washington Square Park in Manhattan. It was a 10-story loft structure built for commercial tenancy, designed for vertical production, leased by capital, filled by labor, and evaluated by insurers before it was evaluated by the people trapped inside. The building had been completed only a decade earlier, and by New York standards it was modern. It had had passenger elevators, freight elevators, electric power, and an iron and steel skeleton protected by terracotta fireproofing. That phrase mattered. Fireproofing was the language developers used when they wanted lenders, tenants, insurers, and municipal inspectors to feel technically reassured. The word fireproof did not mean what workers needed it to mean. It meant the frame could resist collapse. It meant the owner's square footage could remain monetizable. It meant the building could burn internally, kill internally, and still stand externally. This distinction is the entire case. A fireproof building is not automatically a survivable building. Fireproofing protects capital from combustion, while egress protects people from containment. The Asch Building was engineered around the first principle, then failed at the second with administrative precision. The structure belonged to the age of vertical Manhattan, when land value had begun pushing factories upward. Manufacturing no longer needed to spread horizontally across cheap ground. It could climb, stack wages above rent, compress bodies and machines into floors above narrow streets, and call the result efficiency. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company occupied the upper levels of the building. Its operations spread across the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, where the firm produced shirtwaists, the mass-market blouses of the early 20th century. The garment looked light on the street. Inside the factory, it required a dense industrial sequence of cutting, stitching, pressing, sorting, bundling, inspection, packing, and shipping. Every shirtwaist moved through hands, needles, pedals, belts, tables, thread, and time. Time was the real material. The owners bought it cheaply. The building rented it vertically. The machines converted it into inventory. The workers were mostly young immigrant women and girls, many Jewish and Italian, many recently arrived, and many already absorbed into a city that had learned how to price their hours before learning their names. This is usually where sentimental versions of the story begin. This audit begins with architecture. The Asch Building was not a shack, an accidental ruin, or a medieval fire trap with crude walls and primitive design. It was a modern loft building operating inside a modern city, under modern commercial assumptions, with modern finance wrapped around every floor. Its danger did not come from backwardness. Its danger came from optimization. The factory floor was a machine larger than the sewing machines inside it. Long tables organized motion into lanes, while operators sat close enough for supervision, speed, and production counts. Fabric moved from cutter to finisher. Finished bundles moved toward shipment. Scrap fell into bins. Tissue patterns hung above tables, while cotton dust entered the air and cloth fibers absorbed oil from machines and hands. The workplace produced garments and fuel at the same time. That was the first equation. A fireproof skeleton surrounded combustible contents. A vertical building held inadequate escape. Property preservation stood above worker movement. The building's advertised strength became the moral cover for its operational weakness. People heard fireproof and assumed safety. Owners heard fireproof and understood insurance. Inspectors saw a modern frame and missed the factory packed inside it. A building can be structurally advanced and socially lethal. Manhattan proved that before dinner on a Saturday. The Triangle factory usually employed hundreds of workers, and the upper floors held rows of machines, crowded tables, narrow aisles, suspended paper patterns, bolts of cloth, baskets of cuttings, and human movement reduced to managed repetition. The sewing machine was the basic unit of production, but the floor plan was the instrument of control. The operator sat at the machine. Her foot worked the treadle or motor control. Her hand guided cloth under the needle, while the needle drove downward, and the thread locked the seam. The foreman counted output. The owner counted margin. The building counted rent. Inside that sequence, the worker's body became a replaceable operating component. Her fingers aligned fabric, her eyes tracked the seam, and her spine absorbed the day. Her wages remained small enough to preserve profit and large enough to keep her returning. The machine did not need cruelty. It needed rhythm. A shirtwaist factory did not look like a furnace when it was functioning. It looked like order. Tables aligned, machines repeated, bundles accumulated, supervisors walked, bells marked time, elevators moved goods, and doors filtered entry and exit. The danger was embedded in routine, which is how profitable systems hide violence from themselves. Nobody had to announce a death policy. The policy sat in the layout. The upper floors concentrated labor where ladders could not reliably reach. The fire escape was external and insufficient. The stairways were vulnerable to smoke, flame, confusion, and control. The elevators looked like mechanical salvation until heat, crowding, and failure converted them into shafts. The building did not kill because it hated. Buildings do not hate. It killed because every design priority had been ranked before the workers were ranked. This was spatial accounting. A human body requires a clear path, breathable air, unlocked doors, functional stairs, and time. Capital requires protected structure, insured inventory, enforceable tenancy, and controlled labor flow. The Asch Building reconciled those needs in favor of capital until fire exposed the reconciliation. The fireproof frame survived. The workers did not. That was not contradiction. That was design hierarchy. Chapter 2. The 15-cent lock. The central instrument of the triangle fire was not flame. It was a boundary. A lock is a small object with a cylinder, a bolt, a keyway, a strike plate, screws, and a decision hidden inside metal. It can be bought cheaply, installed quickly, justified administratively, and defended legally after the bodies are removed. At Triangle, the lock did not merely secure a door. It priced movement. The 9th floor became the critical zone because escape depended on routes governed by management. Workers had access in theory to stairs, elevators, windows, and a fire escape, but in practice, every route contained a failure point. The Washington Place stairway door became the most consequential piece of hardware in the building. It was reportedly locked during working hours. The stated reasons were managerial and familiar: to prevent theft, control breaks, inspect purses, limit unauthorized movement, reduce union activity, and maintain production discipline. These reasons sound small because the property being protected was small. Scraps of cloth, bits of lace, thread, and minutes away from machines were treated as threats to profit. The labor system converted minor inventory risk into confinement policy. Fabric fragments gain more legal protection than the bodies producing the garments. The lock was cheap. The consequence was structural. This was spatial violence in its pure administrative form. There was no weapon, no speech, and no overt attack. There was only the removal of exit from people whose labor had already been enclosed. The worker could enter the floor because labor had value. She could not freely leave because uncontrolled movement threatened value. The door expressed property rights. The body met the door as trespass. In a better building, a locked door is a defect. In Triangle, it was a procedure. The lock helped management treat every exiting worker as a possible theft event. The purse became evidence, the stairway became a checkpoint, and the workday became custody softened by wages. The language matters. They did not call it detention. They called it supervision. They did not call it confinement. They called it loss prevention. They did not call it coercion. They called it discipline. Every era invents clean words for dirty arrangements. The garment trade had many of them, including efficiency, oversight, safeguarding materials, protecting stock, and keeping order. These phrases let a private employer convert rented floor space into a controlled perimeter, while leaving the legal system enough ambiguity to survive later scrutiny. That ambiguity would matter. At trial, the prosecution would need to prove more than death. Death was visible, counted, stacked in morgues and listed in newspapers, but procedure demanded a narrower question. Was the door locked? Did the owners know it was locked? Did that lock cause the death of a specific victim? Could knowledge attach directly to Max Blanck and Isaac Harris beyond reasonable doubt? That is how 146 deaths became a key problem. A lock turns physically before it turns legally. In the factory, the bolt either withdraws or does not. In court, the same bolt enters testimony, memory, cross-examination, burden of proof, reasonable doubt, and jury instruction. Hardware becomes language. Language becomes fog. Fog becomes acquittal. The door's violence was mechanical before it was legal. Imagine the 9th floor without melodrama, because melodrama usually protects the viewer from analysis. Start with the room as a diagram. Place rows of machines across it. Place cutting tables, shirt-waist bundles, scrap bins, workers in lanes, and a stairway door behind part of the room's geometry. Then place management priorities over the exits. The floor becomes a sorting device. Fast workers remain seated, slow workers are pressured, finished garments move outward, and workers move only under permission. The door is not passive. It edits behavior. A locked exit changes the meaning of every aisle, because it converts a route into a trap once conditions change. Under ordinary production, it feels like discipline. Under fire, it becomes a verdict. The metal does not change. The environment changes around it. This is why the price of the lock matters less than the logic behind it. A cheap mechanism performed expensive work. It preserved fabric from petty theft, minutes from unauthorized breaks, and the owner's command over the floor. It also preserved the conditions necessary for mass death. In accounting terms, the lock was a low-cost control. In physical terms, it was a lethal bottleneck. The owners did not need to imagine every future consequence. The system rewarded them for imagining only immediate loss. A scrap of cloth could be stolen today. A worker could leave early today. A union organizer could pass through today. A fire might happen later. The business mind discounts later risk when present control produces measurable savings. That discount rate killed. The door also reveals the legal psychology of property. A stolen scrap has an owner. A delayed shipment has a cost. A wasted minute has a wage value. A trapped worker becomes legally complicated. This inversion did not require a secret conspiracy. It required ordinary commercial practice, weak regulation, and a court system built to isolate intent from outcome. The locked door sat at the intersection of all three. It was small enough for management to justify and large enough to block survival. That is the danger of cheap hardware. It scales. One lock can regulate hundreds of bodies. One key can divide management from labor. One closed route can turn an industrial floor into a pressure chamber. One missing fact in court can separate moral causation from legal responsibility. The Triangle Fire began before ignition. It began when exit was subordinated to inventory. The flame only activated the design. Chapter 3. The Combustion Equation. At approximately 4:40 p.m. on March 25, 1911, the Triangle factory stopped behaving like a workplace and started behaving like a sealed furnace. The first flame did not need a grand entrance. It only needed a scrap bin. Inside that bin sat the factory's hidden fuel account: cotton cuttings, loose thread, dry cloth dust, paper patterns, and discarded fragments from the garments the workers had been paid to assemble. The bin had been fed all day. Every cut added surface area. Every sweep pushed more fiber into one place. Every hour dried the waste further under electric lamps, machine heat, and the stale air of a crowded loft. Then ignition entered the pile. The room accepted it. The fire did not spread like a monster. It spread like an inventory transfer. Cotton caught first because cotton was light, dry, and already shredded into breathable fragments. Tissue patterns lifted next, thin enough to curl before workers could name the source. Machine oil heated along the tables, wooden surfaces took the flame from below, and finished shirtwaists became folded fuel waiting for classification. The factory had stored combustion in layers. The workers had been sewing inside it. The oxygen in the room became property. That is the exact mechanism. The air did not remain neutral once flame began consuming it. The cotton wanted oxygen. The paper wanted oxygen. The oil vapors wanted oxygen. The exposed wooden table edges wanted oxygen. The workers' lungs entered the same auction, and they lost before the doors fully disappeared behind smoke. They were outbid by inventory. The room had been designed to preserve production flow, so the aisles narrowed around machines, tables, baskets, bundles, and bodies. The same density that made the factory profitable made it resistant to escape. A worker had to stand, turn, locate a route, avoid the chairs, avoid the tables, avoid the fire line, avoid falling bodies, and reach a door that management had treated as a checkpoint. Those seconds were spent like wages. The 9th floor became a locked box with breathing labor inside it. Smoke moved faster than decision. The first workers near the flame saw orange in the scrap and reached for water, but that motion already belonged to a lost interval. The hose failed to perform meaningful rescue. The buckets carried too little volume. The flame entered fabric faster than hands could carry water back to it. The equipment recorded preparedness. It did not create survival. As smoke thickened, the room changed categories. It was no longer a factory. It became a blackened pressure chamber filled with machine legs, chair backs, table corners, cloth piles, and human collision. Workers pushed toward routes that had been reduced by furniture, fire, and policy. Bodies became bottlenecks. A girl reaching the stair door did not meet a moral question. She met hardware. A hand on a knob is a mechanical test. The wrist turns. The latch should release. The body should pass through. At Triangle, that test failed for too many workers at the exact second when failure carried a death sentence. Behind them, the fire kept eating air. The lungs reacted before the mind could organize language. Breath shortened, throats closed, and eyes watered into uselessness as the room filled with the oily stink of heated machine parts, burning cloth, hair, varnish, and paper ash. The smell did not float above the event. It entered mouths, stuck to tongues, and turned inhalation into intake of factory residue. The workers were breathing their workplace. Each machine became an obstacle once its operator stood. Chairs caught knees, skirts caught table corners, and bundles blocked foot placement. Workers who had spent the day making garments now had to climb through the raw material of the business to reach an exit the business had restricted. That is the physical audit. The factory killed through arrangement before a flame touched skin. Heat drove people away from the origin point, while smoke drove them lower toward the floor, where movement had already been consumed by legs, pedals, chair rungs, discarded cloth, and other bodies. The room did not offer empty space. It offered production space. Production space has no mercy once everyone tries to move at once. A factory floor processes labor in order. A fire processes labor in piles. The workers did not simply burn. They were mechanically suffocated by the inventory they were hired to sew. The cotton consumed the room's oxygen. The tissue carried flame over heads and tables. The machine oil thickened the smoke with an industrial taste. The narrow aisles forced bodies into each other, while the locked or blocked routes converted movement into impact, and impact into delay. Delay was fatal. The fire lasted minutes because it did not need more. In those minutes, the building's design hierarchy became visible. The steel frame resisted collapse. The terracotta fireproofing protected structural capital. The floors held, the walls held, and the asset maintained its future value, while the people inside lost access to air, exits, and time. The building had been engineered to survive heat. The workers had been managed into fuel. Chapter 4. The gravity problem. The workers who jumped from the windows were not choosing death. They were selecting the remaining exit. That distinction is necessary. A jump from the 9th floor is often described as desperation, which is true but incomplete. It was also a physical bypass of locked architecture. When horizontal movement failed, bodies moved vertically. Gravity became the only route that management had not locked, priced, inspected, or supervised. The state failed to provide horizontal exits. Physics provided a vertical one. The window was not designed as an exit. It became one because the sanctioned exits failed. In building code language, this is catastrophic egress collapse. In plain terms, the room no longer offered a way out compatible with continued life. A body at a window performs a calculation faster than speech. Smoke pressed from behind. Heat advanced from behind. The crowd pushed from behind. Below waited the street, the air, and the final impact. The body does not need to articulate the calculation. Muscles make it. Hands reach the sill. Feet leave the floor. The building releases the worker only by refusing to keep her alive. This is the final cruelty of vertical industry. The same height that multiplies rent multiplies the force of falling. Gravity is impartial. That does not make it innocent. The vertical distance from the upper floors to the pavement turned escape into impact. Firefighters below watched bodies arrive faster than rescue could be organized. Nets tore, ladders failed to reach, and the street became an extension of the factory floor, receiving workers the building could no longer contain. This was a transfer of failure from floor to window, from window to air, and from air to pavement. The bodies falling from the Asch Building changed public perception because they made labor conditions visible in the street. Locked doors are hidden inside buildings. Low wages are hidden inside ledgers. Scrap bins are hidden under tables. Court evasions are hidden inside procedure. Falling bodies cannot be hidden while they are falling. The city saw the cost because the cost left the building. That visibility mattered politically, but it did not change the physics. By the time a crowd sees the failure has already completed its work. Spectators become witnesses after design has become outcome. The jumpers also exposed a false assumption in fireproof architecture. If a building remains standing while occupants fall from it, the building has succeeded only in the narrowest financial sense. It has preserved itself by shedding life. The Asch Building did exactly what a capital protective structure could do. It endured, held its frame, and kept its rentable future. The workers became the combustible loss. A building can be called fireproof while its occupants burn because the adjective was never primarily moral. It was actuarial. It belonged to insurance forms, rental advertisements, construction claims, and municipal confidence. It measured the asset's ability to remain insurable after internal disaster. The jumpers corrected the vocabulary. They showed that fireproof did not mean deathproof. The bodies falling from the windows were not anomalies in the system. They were outputs. They represented blocked stairs, failed alarms, inadequate fire escapes, unreachable floors, and a legal culture that treated employer control as normal until flame made it grotesque. Each fall translated policy into motion. Property rights had held the door. Gravity took the appeal. The street below became a courtroom without procedure. It admitted all evidence instantly. It did not require a key, owner knowledge, or survivor testimony under cross-examination. It accepted the body and returned only impact. That is why the gravity problem belongs at the center of the story. It strips away defense language. A worker does not jump 9 stories because a workplace was merely imperfect. She jumps because the interior has become less survivable than the fall. That is an architectural indictment, even when a court refuses to convert it into a criminal conviction. The fire compressed choices into physics. Workers were forced toward burning, suffocation, crushing, or falling. These were not choices in any meaningful civic sense. They were terminal outputs produced by a room stripped of lawful exit. A society that offers workers only fatal options should not describe their final motion as voluntary. The motion was coerced by design. The city later remembered the fire as a reform moment. That is accurate. It is also convenient. Reform stories allow institutions to convert prior negligence into later virtue. The dead become instructional material, legislatures hold hearings, codes improve, and memorials appear. The system learns after bodies have paid tuition, not. History then praises the learning and moves past the invoice. The invoice remained. 146 people were dead. The building was intact. The owners were acquitted. The insurance was collected, and the settlement was reduced. The lesson was expensive because the people buying it were not the people paying for it. Chapter 5. The Ledger of Max Blanck and Isaac Harris. Max Blanck and Isaac Harris were known as the Shirtwaist Kings. The phrase sounds decorative. It was financial. By 1908, their Triangle operation had reportedly reached $1 million in sales. The company produced more than 1,000 shirtwaists a day and became one of the largest blouse manufacturers in New York. The owners understood scale. They understood output. They understood how a small saving repeated across hundreds of workers and thousands of garments becomes a fortune. They also understood fire insurance. The garment industry at the time carried a known moral hazard. Clothing styles changed quickly. Inventory could lose value. A warehouse or factory filled with unfashionable goods could become more profitable burned than sold. Insurance journals and industry observers recognized the danger. A policy could turn obsolete stock into recoverable capital. Fire could liquidate what the market no longer wanted. This does not require cinematic villainy. It requires arithmetic. Blanck and Harris had prior suspicious fire claims associated with earlier business operations. The record around the Triangle fire does not prove that they intentionally set the 1911 blaze. That distinction must stay intact. A forensic script should not replace evidence with appetite. The stronger point is colder. Their business world had already made fire financially intelligible. Fire was not only danger. It was an accounting event. A factory owner insures stock, fixtures, machinery, business interruption, and property interest. A fire then destroys goods, interrupts operations, triggers claims, invites adjusters, and converts damaged assets into payment. If the payout exceeds actual loss, the fire becomes profitable even without legal proof of arson. That is the space where morality and accounting part ways like subway tracks. The Triangle fire entered that space. After the disaster, the owners ultimately collected approximately $60,000 more in insurance money than the fire cost them in damages. The arithmetic has been summarized as roughly $400 in profit per dead worker. The phrase is indecent because the math is indecent. It does not mean the policy literally priced bodies as insured objects. It means the fire's net financial result can be divided by the number of human deaths, revealing the ratio between casualty and owner recovery. 146 people died, and the owners gained surplus compensation. The ledger accepted both entries. This is corpse arbitrage before the formal chapter on corpse arbitrage. Death created political cost, reputational cost, litigation risk, and temporary business disruption. Insurance converted physical loss into money. Weak accountability limited personal consequence. Civil settlement reduced family compensation. The result was not merely survival by the owners. It was positive recovery. The factory floor had always been a ledger. Wages, machines, rent, cloth, locks, and insurance had all been entries before the fire. After the fire, deaths became entries too. Blanck and Harris did not stand outside their era. They were skilled operators inside it. That makes them more useful to study, not less. A singular monster allows the system to excuse itself, but a competent businessman following available incentives indicts the market around him. The Triangle owners had already fought labor organizing. After the 1909 uprising by shirtwaist workers, they agreed to some demands while resisting union recognition. Unionization would have threatened managerial discretion over shop rules, including control over exits, inspections, breaks, and discipline. The lock on the door was therefore part of a broader labor conflict, not a random safety oversight. Control over movement is control over bargaining. A worker who can leave can organize. A worker who can organize can negotiate. A worker who can negotiate can alter cost. The locked door protected more than scraps. It protected the authority structure of the shop. It kept managerial command physically embedded in the room. It made the factory less like a workplace and more like a guarded production enclosure. Then fire tested the enclosure. After the disaster, Blanck and Harris did not vanish into permanent ruin. They defended themselves publicly, hired one of New York's most expensive and skilled defense attorneys, Max Stoya, went to trial, and were acquitted. Later, the Triangle firm moved to another location. Later still, Blanck was fined after another factory exit door violation. The number of that fine matters. $20. That was the state's later pricing signal. A locked exit after Triangle cost $20. A city can claim reform while still issuing prices that teach contempt. A fine is not merely punishment. It is market information. If the cost of violation remains small, violation remains a business option. Capital reads penalties as expenses when the law fails to make them existential. The owners understood that language. Most owners do. The ledger of Blanck and Harris is not valuable because it reveals hidden psychology. It is valuable because it shows visible incentives. Cheap labor, vertical factories, weak enforcement, suspicious insurance culture, locked doors, and procedural criminal law formed a complete economic environment. The fire moved through that environment as efficiently as flame through tissue paper. Nobody needed to write profit from death in a notebook. The system wrote it in totals. Chapter 6. The Trial of Property. The trial began after the bodies had already done the work of evidence. 146 people were dead. The building still stood, and the owners sat in court. That should have been enough for any moral system, so naturally the legal system demanded a smaller object. It wanted a key. The courtroom did not process the factory as a killing machine. It processed a door. More precisely, it processed whether one door had been locked, whether a specific victim had reached it, whether the owners knew its condition, and whether that knowledge could be pinned to them with enough precision to satisfy 12 jurors. The dead were reduced to a hinge. The prosecution brought survivors who described smoke, pressure, blocked movement, the Washington Place stairway door, hands reaching for exit, and a factory floor where escape had been subordinated to control. Max Stoyer did not need to resurrect the dead. He needed to damage the witnesses. His method was mechanical. He asked survivors to repeat their accounts, then marked the repetition as suspicious. If a witness remembered the same facts in similar words, the memory became rehearsal. If the testimony held together, Stoyer treated the structure as evidence of coaching. Consistency became contamination. The survivors had escaped fire, then entered cross-examination. The court did not ask whether the factory had operated like a trap. It asked whether a particular lock could convict two particular men. That was the narrowing device. The larger arrangement disappeared behind legal measurement. The locked inspections, the crowded floor, the absent sprinklers, the failed hose, the useless fire escape, the ladder height, the building height, and the managerial suspicion of workers all mattered to the event. The trial pulled the event into a single metal question. Did the key turn? Who knew? When? That was the machine. 146 bodies could not enter the jury room as one fact. They had to be converted into admissible units. The prosecution selected a victim. The defense attacked the root. The judge instructed. The stenographer recorded. The jury listened to death being trimmed into procedure. The courtroom produced clean paper. The factory had produced ash. On December 27, 1911, Max Blanck and Isaac Harris were acquitted. The verdict did not claim the workers had lived. It did not claim the 9th floor had been safe. It did not claim the door had opened cleanly under pressure. It only stated that the prosecution had failed to attach criminal guilt with the necessary legal precision. The system did not count the dead. It inspected the lock. That was enough. Chapter 7. The corpse arbitrage. Now audit the settlement. The owners ultimately received approximately $60,000 more from insurance than the actual damages cost them. Divide that surplus by 146 dead workers, and the number approaches $400 per body. Later civil settlement to families amounted to a far smaller figure, commonly reported as $75 per deceased victim. That is the arithmetic. Do not soften it. The insurance surplus was about $60,000. The human casualties numbered 146. The owner's surplus per casualty approached $400, while the family settlement per death was about $75. A dead worker's family received less than the owner's surplus ratio generated by the death event. This is corpse arbitrage. Arbitrage occurs when a system allows profit from price differences across markets. Here, the markets were insurance recovery, legal liability, labor replacement, and human loss. The owners did not need to insure the bodies directly. The bodies only needed to die inside an insured business event whose property losses were overcompensated and whose legal consequences were contained. The corpse became financially adjacent to profit. That adjacency is enough. A fire destroyed stock, fixtures, records, and production capacity. Insurance addressed those categories because property knows how to speak in contracts. A worker's lost life entered a different system made of family grief, civil litigation, uncertain dependency, immigrant poverty, and negotiated settlement. Property moved through claims adjusters. Death moved through bargaining. Property recovered better. That is the audit finding. The number $400 per worker is not merely a rhetorical weapon. It is a conversion table. It converts the moral scale of the fire into the language the owner's world respected: money, surplus, loss, recovery, and an ratio. Once translated, the scandal becomes harder to sentimentalize and easier to prosecute intellectually. One girl did not die in abstraction. Her death sat beside a surplus calculation. One cutter did not vanish into history. His absence coexisted with claim payment. One operator did not merely become a name on a memorial. Her final workday became part of an insured event. The insurance surplus was approximately $60,000. There were 146 dead workers. The arithmetic produced roughly $400 in surplus per corpse. That number did not appear on a death certificate. It appeared through division. The owners did not insure the workers as bodies. They insured stock, fixtures, machinery, goods, and business loss. The dead entered the calculation indirectly, because the fire that killed them also triggered the claim that overpaid the owners. Property spoke first. Bodies spoke through families. The families received fractions. Civil settlements reportedly paid about $75 per dead worker. The number was smaller than the owner's surplus ratio. That was the comparison. No sermon was required. The figures already performed the autopsy. A dead worker's family received $75. The owners cleared roughly $400 per body. The factory had burned upward. The money moved upward too. This is the cleanest ledger in the case. Insurance converted burned goods into recovered capital. Civil settlement converted burned workers into limited liability. Criminal court converted 146 deaths into doubt around a lock. The building converted catastrophe into continued real estate. Everything important survived except the workers. Blanck and Harris did not need public forgiveness. They needed legal clearance. They needed financial recovery. They got both. The families received names, funerals, bills, and reduced payments. The owners received surplus compensation. The city received a reform scandal. The newspapers received images, and the building received a future. The ledger closed without embarrassment. Chapter 8. The Final Audit. The building still stands. The former Asch Building, later known as the Brown Building, remains at Washington Place and Green Street. It is now part of New York University property. Students passed through a structure whose frame survived a fire that killed the people working inside it. The plaques explain the deaths. The walls preserve the asset. That is the final evidence. The fire did not erase the building, the owners, the insurance system, or the courtroom transcript. It erased workers faster than it erased the value of the property around them. The city later passed reforms. The record still holds the arithmetic. 146 dead. Approximately $60,000 in excess insurance recovery. Roughly $400 per corp. About $75 paid to each family. The building remained useful. The ledger remained intact. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was not merely a disaster inside a building. It was an audit of a civilization confident enough to call a structure fireproof while leaving human escape negotiable. It showed that modernity can protect beams, columns, contracts, and claims, while treating workers as movable, burnable, and replaceable inputs. The building was engineered to survive. The workers were engineered to be expendable. The tragedy was profitable. That is the final entry. The building was fireproof. The ledger was bulletproof. The workers were simply inventory that caught fire.